lesson today is called The Champion's Last Reform. And the chief message is, it is not sufficient to do a job and to leave it to others after you've completed it. I've made that mistake. Maybe you have too. A champion's job is never done. It goes from sun to sun. Paul revisited his churches. Not only had he dug the foundations, and not only had he put in the walls, but he went back to see those churches and see how they were getting along. It's not enough for you to be a champion. You must go back and review your championship. It's not easy. Paul not only visited them, he sent them letters. Most of the New Testament is made up of those letters that he sent to them. This means that champions follow up their victories in order to keep the victories, you see, in order to sustain the victories. In Nehemiah 5:14, it says, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year even to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, that is 12 years, I and my brethren have not eaten of the bread of the governor. He was telling you that he had been no liability, that he had served without pay, and that he had not eaten the food of the poor and the common people, that he had been a faithful man under that time. From Nehemiah 2:1, it says, it was the 20th year of the empire when the champion came into power. He had been 12 years building up Jerusalem, and now he had brought security and prosperity to the capital city. He had achieved point number one. And in Nehemiah chapter 11, chapter 13 and verse 6, it says, but in all this time was I not at Jerusalem. So he had left Jerusalem and gone back to his job in Persia for a time. It says, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes king of Babylon came I unto the king after certain days. I obtained leave of the king that he might return here. He had to come back and to see how the job was getting along that he had done. You know, he had to review the things that he had done. And the champion discovered what I have discovered also in my ministry, and what you will discover in yours. He discovered a terrible backsliding in so short an absence from his labors. In Jeremiah 13:7, he says, I came to Jerusalem and understood of the evil that Tiashib had done for Tobiah. Now Tobiah and Sanballat were the two chief men that stopped the wall. They did all the terrible things to Nehemiah. And now that Nehemiah was out of town, they came to the subordinates and had a new story to tell. Listen what they had done. One of the chief priests here had prepared, it's in your Bible, in Nehemiah 13:7, they had prepared a chamber in the courts of the house of God. They had made him an apartment in the temple to live in. The very man that fought them, and the very man that hated them, and the very man that sought to destroy, he had an apartment in the temple of God. You know, it has always amazed me in the work that I've done around the world to see what men did that followed me. And I became amazed, you know, that they didn't follow my spirit and my aspiration and my desires. But when I was out of town, a new thing happened, you know. For that reason, you just need to come back to town. You know, if you have built for God, go back and survey it and see how it's getting along. And he found that a chief enemy of God's work, named Tobiah, had caused an apartment to be made for him in the temple of God. It is almost unbelievable how foes come and subdue your friends if you're out of town. So Nehemiah, in his last reform, because he was a reformer, in his last reform, it was not laying blocks, it was not building walls, it was not putting in gates. His last reform was with the people. With the people. Now you better believe me, that is the work of champions, with the people. Now look, and I want you to get this. And Nehemiah 13:8, it says, it grieved me sorely. Therefore I cast forth all the household of Tobiah. The whole gang had moved into God's temple, and they were pagan and heathen. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers. Boy, he didn't just throw them out. He had them to wash it down and repaint it. You see? To cleanse the chambers. And thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God. He brought back the things that belonged in there. He brought back in the holy the holy instruments of God, and put them back in there. And thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meat offering and the frankincense. They had stopped burning the incense unto the Lord, and they had stopped bringing in the offerings, and had a pagan and a heathen living in that area. Now backsliding is terrible. All denominations backslide. When champions die, their followers backslide. It's too bad. You can only do your best you can while you're living. You know, do the best you can. If possible, do like Moses did. Prepare your own successor. Raise up your own successor, and at least for 2 generations, you'll have it made. At least for 2 generations. So Nehemiah personally and forcibly removed the enemies out of the house of God and brought back the worship into the house of the Lord. And then look in chapter 13, verse 10, which is the next verse. He says, I perceive that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. He left town, and they moved the worship out and put a heathen in there, and then they stopped giving to the preachers. They stopped supplying the needs of the preachers. It said he saw that the Levites, who were the ministers there in the temple, that they hadn't been given anything to eat. And it says the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled away to his field. So they'd gone back into the country. They're no longer worshiping in the temple, no longer carrying on the work of God in the temple, because they didn't have enough to eat. It is amazing how you can build a great work for God, and how your subordinates and your people that follow you, how those people can come. It is amazing. And see the thing go lower, become downgraded, and doesn't have your spirit. I'm having to teach you, champion, something, because I've lived a long time. And I know what happens to what you have done, because I've had it happen, you see, and I know what will happen. He did too. You see, he came back to see what it was all about. And when he did, he learned that the ministry, the spiritual life had decayed. The people no longer even took care of the ministry, the singers, the ministers that taught, and they had fled away from the temple, out to the countryside, and were working in the fields. What a degradation of the priesthood. What a terrible thing to abandon the musical ministry of God, and to desert temple worship, and to run away. So, the champion, and the next verse, and Nehemiah 13:11 says, then contended I with the rulers. You see, you got to hit this thing in the right place. The ones at the top are to blame. And said, why is the house of God forsaken? Isn't that amazing? They had built the house of God under duress, under great suffering, and now the people didn't care for it. It's beyond human amazement, you know. And when I see that, you know, the great men of God are not appreciated, I can't tell you what it does for my insides. It shows you common people do not have discernment. They do not have knowledge. They don't know what they're living for, nor how to live. The house of God is forsaken, so I gathered those rulers together, and I set them in their places. Backsliding always begins at the top, but champions put people in their places. Champions put people in their places, you see. He said he put them all back into their places. In Nehemiah 13:12 it says, then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn and the new wine and oil unto the treasuries. They'd stopped paying their tithes. When a church stops paying its tithes, it's dead. And you can be part of that deadness yourself. If you don't pay your tithes, you're part of the deadness of the devil on the face of this earth. Oh, you said the church just wants money. Well, so does the circus. So does the tavern. So does the fruit market. So does the vegetable market. Since when do you pull up to a gas station and get gas with no money? Why don't you think straight? In the Jewish religion, I was talking to a rabbi recently. In the Jewish religion, no person comes to worship without a gift to God. Even the little children have their gifts to God. You just don't come to worship the God of the universe and come in empty-handed like a fool. You come in and say, I love you. I love you. Here's my love gift to you. And if it's not one that's acceptable to him, he refuses it. He says, no, that's not what you're supposed to give. You're supposed to give this. He wants you to give after his blessings upon your lives. And God expects you to do that. And so he brought back from the whole nation the tithe that belonged to the Lord, the corn and the wine, into the treasures. In verse 13, which is the next verse, and he said, I made treasurers, men, over the treasuries. He got that thing organized. And he named the people here that he had put in charge of this, and all of them on down, for they were counted faithful. That's in that same verse. He put these men over this because they were faithful men. God is looking for faithful people today. God is looking for faithful people today. And their office was to distribute unto their brethren. You know, many times when a man gets to the top and a man gets control of the money, he will not treat the subordinates right. It's been a problem all over the world, problems of denominations. When a man gets his clutches on the money, then he starts bossing, then he starts doing it his own way, and he starts neglecting those that should have. That is a terrible thing. That is a terrible thing. And champions don't do that kind of thing. All right. In the same chapter, we're in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 14. He says, remember me, O God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for the offices thereof. Here was a man that when he had cleaned up the house, when he had cleaned out the sinners, he spoke to God and said, God, I hope I've done what's right. You know, human beings are human beings. And he just wanted God to know that whatever he was doing it for the cause of God. He was doing it with the right purposes in his heart. And he says, God, I'm just wanting to do the right thing here. Help me to do the right thing. And of course, he did do the right thing. He says what he had done for the house of God. He had done nothing for Nehemiah. He had made no profit for himself. He had made him a soft bed to lay upon. He had, his total care was the house of the Most High God. In the next verse, that's in Nehemiah 13:15, he says, in those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath day. You see, when you don't pay your tithes, very likely you won't even appreciate the Lord's day. You won't give any attention to God's day. God wants a day of rest for you, you see. And when you neglect paying your tithes to God, you will also neglect that. He says, I saw them working on the Sabbath day, bringing in sheaves, lading asses, and also wine, and grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, on the worship day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. And so here was a people that had been blessed of God when they were nothing and had nothing. A man of God came and he built those walls. And after they got prosperity and got everything they needed, they forgot God. Our country is full of such people today. And there's where champions come in. Only champions. They won't listen to anybody else. They have to listen to a man of experience. They have to listen to a man that has achieved. And he said, look what you've done. You chased the preachers out, and they're off in the fields working here, and now you're working on the Sabbath day, and you're treating it as if it was any other day. You've deserted the temple, and nobody goes to church there anymore. He says, it's time to do something about it. Listen what he says in verse 16 of that same. He says, there dwelt men of Tyre, and therein, you see, foreigners had come in, pagans and heathen, who sold their fish and all manner of ware, and sold them on the Sabbath day, who? To the children of Judah in Jerusalem, contaminated by sinners, contaminated by sin. You better get the whole book. If you're going to be a champion, it's not all laying blocks. It's not all building walls. You have to deal with people. We're people. And we're straight toward communicators with human beings. Verse 17 says, I contended with the nobles of Judah. That's where your problem's always, with the top people. And said unto them, what evil thing is this you do? And profane the Sabbath day. Did not your fathers thus? And did not our God bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath? See, he had just gotten back from slavery. And he said, didn't your fathers do the same thing? Didn't they get carried away to Babylon because of this? Why do you do it? The job of a champion is not all work in the dirt. Sometimes it's work with human beings. And you have to do it, or you cannot be God's champion. The next verse says, it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants sat at the gates, and there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. You see, he had to enforce the people to live the way that God wanted them to live. Look at the next verse. It says, the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of ware, you see, lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. And then I testified against them and said, why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I'll lay my own hands upon you. And from that time forth, they came no more on the Sabbath day. So if they couldn't get you to do business and you close the door, they'd sit right outside the door and say, come on, yeah, come on out, you know. If you don't think the devil, you know, deceives people, you're just not too well acquainted with him yet. And so said, come out here and buy, come out here and buy. He said, stop lingering around that gate. Get on out of here, leave. Neighbors, if you're going to be holy, be holy. Don't be halfway house. If you're going to be clean, not half clean. If you're going to go to heaven, go all the way. You know, God's looking for champions. Champions of leadership. Champions that'll speak the truth, that will love him. The next verse says, and I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves. You see, the preachers had to get clean. There's no need of telling the lay people to be clean when the preachers are not clean. He said, you Levites, cleanse yourselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. Here was a man that disciplined people and then prayed to God about it, you know, time and again. And he says, in those days, also I saw the Jews, now this is the worst one, the champion observed the moral depravity. That it happened so quickly. You know, the thing that amazes me is how a denomination that's born in revival can go down so quickly. In 1 or 2 generations, it can come from praising God to Jonah fish fries in the basement, or to having a carnival outside, and sometimes even selling alcoholic beverage. You see, the devil is against God's work. Now you have to know that. It is a spiritual warfare. And he would like to downgrade and degrade everything that God has on the face of this earth. Only champions can lift us. You have to pray for God to send forth champions. Send forth strong men. Send forth leaders that will stand for God. All right, now listen. This is in Nehemiah 13:23. Now listen to it. It says, in those days, I saw the Jews had married wives of Ashdod, pagans, of Ammon, pagans, of Moab, pagans. They had married heathen. Verse 24 says, and this is what happened when you marry heathen, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. They were half-breeds. Even in their speech, they were half-breeds. Can you imagine so much backsliding in so short a time? You see, that's what amazes me. Churches that were shouting and praising God just a few years ago are all in ritual, sinners sitting out in the congregation as deacons and elders, and we're letting them take over the thing. God has to have champions that'll clean the thing out with a strong hand. So what did he do? That same chapter, we're in chapter 13, verse 25. He says, I contended with them, and I cursed them. You see, sometimes you think the man of God is hard, you know, but until he gets your attention, he can't do anything anyway. He says, I cursed them. Now listen, you won't like this. I smote certain of them. Boy, he socked them side of the head. Can you imagine it? That's the champion, God's champion. He says, I plucked out their hair. Ooh, you wouldn't like him for a preacher, would you? I made them swear by God, saying, ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, of the pagans and the heathens and the idol worshipers going to hell. Nor shall you take their daughters unto your sons, to have your grandchildren growing up to worship idols and to worship the devil. And he says, or for yourselves. The old men were also grabbing these pretty heathen girls, pagan girls. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin in these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all the Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. You marry wrong, and you're very likely to go to the wrong place before it's all over with. Very likely to go to the wrong place. In verse 27 it says, shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to trespass against our God in marrying strange wives? Come on, champion. It's no longer building walls. It's no longer the enemy coming in and you have to have a sword. No, he's married to your son now, married to your daughter now. He has his headquarters over in the church house. Yeah, he has his headquarters in the church house. He's doing his dirty business in church now. We need champions. We need mighty men that'll stand up for God. Here's the worst one. The son of the high priest. And I read it. It's in Nehemiah 13 also. And he said, and one of the sons of Jehoiada, who was the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. The very guy that fought the building of the city and the very guy that wanted to destroy Nehemiah had married his daughter to the son of the high priest. He had hit the top. No wonder he had an apartment in the temple. No wonder he had a place among the dignitaries. Why, his daughter had married into the high family. Neighbors, marriage can damn churches and nations. You don't intermarry with the devil. You don't intermarry with sin. You don't intermarry with immoral people. If you do, you're going to be like them. God help us today. We need it. Then he said, let me read for you. And one of the sons of Jehoiada, who was the son of Eliashib the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, and I chased him from me. He got after him with a stick to wallop him on the head with it. I know you don't like hard preachers. He's too hard. If he's in shape with God, he's not. So remember them, God. They have defiled the priesthood. They've defiled the priesthood. They have defiled the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? The next verse says, thus cleansed I them from all strangers. Isn't that something? And I appointed the wards of the priest and the Levites, and everyone in his business I appointed him, even for the wood offerings at the times appointed, and for the first fruits. And then he ends by saying, remember me, O God, for good. He wasn't a conceited man. He wasn't a man that thought he was great and he alone was great. But he knew the laws of God. He knew what God wanted, and he was God's champion. I want you to be a champion of God. But I want to tell you something. You're going to have to clean immorality out of the church. There are church people that have 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 wives, still singing Amazing Grace. And all the angels shake their heads and says, that's really amazing, but not grace. I want to tell you something. What the laws of the land condone and what preachers condone may not be what God condones. You better have your relationships with the Almighty and have them right and have them clear and have them good. Won't you be a champion? A champion is not just building with his hands. A champion sometime is wringing the heart in holiness and righteousness and goodness. In our land right now, we need mighty champions. Yes, to build great television stations, to build great churches. That is true. We need more champions to clean the filth. Men that have television stations sometimes will let unclean people on the air that have lived immorally. They think that nobody knows it. Don't fool yourself, sir. Everybody knows it. The only one you have fooled is yourself. God wants holiness and he wants purity. It don't matter how well behaved he might be. It just doesn't matter, how intellectual he might be. If he is a sinner, he is a sinner in God's sight. And God is calling you to championship. God is calling us all to championship. And God is calling us all to holiness and to purity and to love and to realize this life is soon over and we have to give an account to God for our lives.